I told my dad that I wanted to be an umpire in the Major League Baseball. I don't know why an umpire specifically, but his response was, well, they don't let women be umpires. And I said, that's okay, I'll just be the first one. That trend kind of continued throughout my life. Like if I ran into a roadblock somewhere, I never saw it as like a permanent no. It was just, okay, this didn't work. So let's find the way around this to make this thing work. If it was something that I cared enough about, I was going to try to figure out how to do it. And I think a lot of people get discouraged more easily. And that's where I think it's really important to find that thing that you are so passionate about that you are willing to like crawl through the mud in like 100-degree heat or something like that to get to the goal that you want.
Studying the Earth brought Dr. Tanya Harrison closer to Mars. Now, as a science strategist working with the top space industries, she connects outer space with groundbreaking technologies, furthering our planet and horizons. Thank you for joining Lynn Foley, host of Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, as we hear from Tanya about her journey.
I've been obsessed with space for about as long as I can remember, thanks to stuff like growing up watching Star Trek as a kid. I really loved going outside and looking at the stars. I got pretty obsessed with the moon for a while because of a film called Big Bird in Japan, where Big Bird from Sesame Street meets the Japanese mythological princess of the moon, Kaguya Hime. And for some reason, that really like set off a huge interest. But it wasn't until I was about 11 when NASA's Pathfinder mission landed on Mars and brought the first Mars rover along with it, this little tiny robot called Sojourner that was the size of like a toaster oven. And when I saw the pictures from the Pathfinder lander of Sojourner driving out onto the surface of Mars, I remember seeing them. This was the first mission that ever had a website, and I thought this is the coolest thing I have ever seen. I have to work on Mars rovers, and I became very singularly focused from then on.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you could explore just a little bit before we move on a little bit about then your early family and then your school and how that maybe promoted that for you.
I had a grandfather who was really into space. Well, I would say science in general, but he had a lot of sky and telescope magazines, and they come with these maps in them of the sky. And this was before the internet was super common. You know, we didn't have phone apps or anything like that. I think my family still had a rotary phone. And so I remember very distinctly when we upgraded from a rotary phone to a cordless phone, the phone would just barely work on the sidewalk outside our house. And my grandfather would send me these issues of Sky and Telescope. And I would be there like sitting on the sidewalk in the dark, looking at them with a flashlight and like have him on the phone. And I would try to describe like, oh, there's a star that's maybe like 2 finger widths below the moon. Like what star is that? And he would try to use the maps in the magazine to help me navigate, as well as the Big Dipper. So I actually have the Big Dipper tattooed behind one of my ears as a symbol of being guided by the stars, both like figuratively and very literally. So I think his encouragement really helped me get nerdy on that front. And then for a little bit, I was raised by essentially my step grandfather, who was very into tech from a computer perspective. So his room in our house was just full of like computers and laptops before people really had them in their houses very much. Ham radios. He attached a CB radio to my walker when I was a kid, and I apparently would walk around the house going CB, CB into the radio. So I think that the two of them were really big influences and kind of pushed me unintentionally in the direction of becoming a scientist down the line.
And I guess if you didn't have that desire yourself, you wouldn't have done that. So I guess that just piled on that influence and took the little person you were into space very early in your days. Your study pathway from then through to your PhD has been one of exploring and changing as you discovered where your passion lay and how to get there within that study. Can you please share a little bit about those, I guess, that weaving pathway through to your PhD?
Yeah, it was definitely not a linear trajectory. I thought as a teenager, kind of going into college, well, I know I want to study Mars. planets are in space, so I should be an astronomer. Luckily, I lived in Seattle at the time, and the University of Washington has one of the best astronomy undergraduate programs in the world, which feels maybe unexpected for Seattle, where it's cloudy and rainy all the time.
Yes.
But it was right in my backyard. And I applied, I got in, but I didn't learn until partway through the program that astronomy is not really the thing to study if you want to study like what is happening on a planet. It's more, formation of stars, formation of solar systems. If you get all the way up to like cosmology, you've got the history of the universe, which is all really exciting stuff. And I loved it, but it wasn't exactly where my passion was. And so I remember having a conversation with one of my professors who said, well, maybe instead of going into a PhD in astronomy, which had been my original plan at that point, I was a sophomore or junior in college, why don't you look into getting a master's degree in geology, and then you can go on and do a PhD? So I I debated for a little bit. I decided to apply to both programs, and I thought maybe the universe will make the decision for me. And then I got into both, so I had to make the decision myself, which was like, oh, okay, well, I know my passion is Mars. It's been Mars for, at that point, 5+ years. I started college when I was quite young. So I decided to do the master's route in geology, and that was definitely the right decision. The getting to actually like look at pictures from satellites coming from Mars, pictures from the rovers, that was really where my dream was. So I did my master's, and then at the end of that, and my grad school experience wasn't great, and so I wasn't sure if I wanted to stick around for a PhD anymore. And I, again, kind of took the dual approach of applying to some PhD programs, but I also started reaching out to folks whose papers I had read for doing my thesis research during my master's, asking if anybody needed somebody to process data for them, because I had done that during my undergrad for astronomy, doing data processing from ground-based and space-based telescopes for professors who were, let's just say, old enough to not be very technologically inclined. So one of them would literally give me stacks of things that he had handwritten and be like, can you turn this into a table? He was wonderful. One of those people that I emailed said, well, you should look at this company in California. They build a lot of the cameras that go to Mars. And I never would have thought to look there, because I would just assume they would want engineers. What would a person with a master's degree in geology do at a company that builds cameras? But they also operate the cameras that they build. And for that, they specifically wanted people with master's degrees in geology that knew something about Mars. That's an extremely small pool of people. I went to their website. They happened to be hiring. And so I applied immediately. I emailed them incessantly, got the interview, and eventually got the job. Did that for a few years, and then realized from that I didn't just want to be working on the missions. I thought it would be cool to be the person that leads a mission or an instrument, because not from like a name recognition standpoint, but I thought it would be cool to be the person that gets to design the strategy as to why we're sending this thing to Mars in the first place. And the chief engineer at the company I worked at said the easiest path to do that will be for you to get a PhD. It would be really hard for NASA to think that you have the credibility to run a mission if you don't have a PhD. So I was like, okay, called up one of the places that I had applied to for PhD a few years earlier, and I had gotten accepted, but then turned down their offer to take this job. I was like, hey, do you remember me? I hope I didn't offend you, but what would you think about me coming on now? And the professor was really excited. He was like, oh yeah, you're even more qualified now because you've been working in the field for a few years. I'd love to have you be my grad student. You don't even have to reapply. So went up there and moved from California to London, Ontario, in the middle of nowhere, and did my PhD.
It feels circuitous when you talk about it, but in fact, it was quite guided. It just took you a little while to find your way through that. Your work roles over the years, and I guess working through that and since your PhD, have been diverse and span academia and industry. Are you able to explore the highlights from these and the key achievements you've had?
After my PhD, the first job that I had was working at Arizona State University for a relatively new program they had launched called the NewSpace Initiative. And they were trying to create partnerships between the university and so-called new space companies. So these new companies that were cropping up, like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, rather than your traditional aerospace primes, as we call them in the industry, to do technology development, mission proposals, instrument proposals, things like that, with ASU, who is a powerhouse when it comes to NASA space missions. Someone had recommended me for the job. They literally called me up before I even finished my PhD, and they were like, "We think you'd be perfect. How soon could you graduate and take this job?" So I didn't even apply. I was basically poached, which was amazing. I felt very lucky. And in that role, I got to do some really amazing things working with the space industry, this new space industry, which was very different from what I had done working at this camera company before, which was very much like an old school traditional NASA subcontractor. They'd been around since 1990. Their only customer really was NASA. These newer companies were taking a totally different approach. So we did some things like we launched some student payloads into space on a Blue Origin rocket. Amazing experience for those students. And I kind of coordinated that relationship between Blue Origin and the university. We became the first embedded, ASU became the first embedded academic partner for a company called Planet when they launched their university programs. So I kind of helped them design the program from the university side of things. And then once that program was done, Planet essentially poached me out of the university. I had been working with them not only on that program, but I used their data in my Mars research. They're an Earth observation satellite company, but I was studying features in the Canadian high Arctic that are what we call analogs for features we see on Mars. And the company had this science ambassadors program where they had a handful of people that they gave free data to in exchange for kind of talking about the data to other scientists to say, like, hey, here's this new data that's available to you. You're probably only used to using NASA data, but like companies provide this stuff now to scientists as well. And so eventually, when that company got a very large contract with NASA, they called me up and they were like, hey, we need somebody that speaks NASA language, academic scientist language, and planet language, like in the company. You already know how to do all that because you've been doing it essentially on our behalf at the university. Would you like to come and work for us? And this was a dream because as somebody with a PhD in Martian landslides, I didn't think I would ever work for like a Silicon Valley startup space company. um, so took that job, worked there for a few years. I basically built up their NASA program, which then ended up kind of expanding to like cohering a bunch of different science programs they had for different types of scientists under this giant banner of science programs at the company. And I got the chance to work with researchers around the world. And every day, you could have a call with somebody that was trying to save walruses in Alaska. And then the next call would be somebody working on coral reef health in Hawaii, and then people working on humanitarian aid in flooded parts of the Congo. It was just all over the place. And it was cool to never know what you were going to see on a day-to-day basis. And then I left that company a couple of years ago, kind of took some time off to like reconsider what I was going to do with my career. I left that company for a lot of reasons, but I ended up kind of coming back in doing consulting because I thought, well, this is a great way to kind of take the stuff that I had built at that company, working with researchers, connecting kind of academia, industry, and government in ways that you don't traditionally see. But instead of just doing that at one company, I could help multiple companies do that and try to increase the impact of what's being done on the research side, but often just gets kind of stuck at the paper stage. Like scientists write papers, they get stuck behind a paywall, and it doesn't necessarily turn into anything in the real world, even if they're doing something that could have an impact. And I think that this really hit home when I was working at Planet, working with a group called NASA Harvest, where during COVID, that group, it's NASA's food security arm, they were contacted by the government of Togo because they wanted to create maps of all the smallholder farms in the country to try to distribute aid to farmers, because they were worried about all the supply chain shutdowns from COVID. So
Yep.
they were worried that it might cause a famine. So within the span of 10 days from when the government sent that request to the folks at NASA to the time we helped them deliver the maps, it was a 10-day turnaround. And the government used that to distribute over 50,000 interest-free loans to smallholder farmers, and they didn't end up having a famine. And that was just such a clear illustration to me of like, oh wow, science, like academic scientists can do stuff that has real world impact, and on a very short time scale too. This all happened in the span of like 4 months, I think, between the maps and the money getting out the door. Granted, COVID was kind of unique circumstances and how quickly
Yes.
people moved. But
Absolutely.
that was kind of the inspiration for thinking like how much more work is being done by researchers at universities that could be having this kind of impact, but it's not making it out the door.
And that's a really big problem, isn't it, when you talk of that triad or triumvirate, however you look at it, to get what goes on in the research through to industry to influence. And that's a great example that you've done of getting it through government into industry or the local industry of that country. And it's a shame because of all the money and the time and the effort that's going on in that scientific research. During your study and your career, you have received a number of awards and fellowships, very prestigious ones. And of course, the one of interest for me today is the Zonta International Amelia Earhart Fellowship. How has this one and others supported you through that?
The Amelia Earhart Fellowship was absolutely critical. It was one of the first fellowships I got during my PhD, and I was not getting paid very much as a TA. So it's a really stressful thing to try to like concentrate on doing your research and also figure out how are you going to pay your rent and feed yourself. The conditions for grad students haven't really changed very much over the years, which is unfortunate. So getting fellowships like this, it really takes stress off of you to think like, okay, I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can actually focus my brain power on doing the research, which is what I'm here in grad school to do. Like I shouldn't be stressing out about these other things. And getting connected with people in the Zonta community, getting the chance to, I gave a couple of talks at different Zonta events, met some really amazing women. By the time I had moved to, I think the first one I did was when I lived in Arizona. And yeah, it's also just cool from somebody that like grew up admiring folks like Amelia Earhart to feel like, wow, I have a fellowship named after her. The pilot's wings that came with it, which I just thought that was so cool. And then I think the one that was really the next game changer was getting the Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship. That's one of the most prestigious graduate fellowships you can get in all of Canada. It's very rarely awarded to international students, from what my PhD supervisor told me at the time. So when he nominated me, I knew the chances were low. I was not expecting anything to come of it. And when it came through, I think we were both shocked, both me and my supervisor. But that one is just such a game changer in the number of doors that it opens. I didn't have to be a TA anymore at that point. I could just focus 100% on doing my research. By the time I got it, my coursework requirements for the PhD were done. And that's just the best position you could possibly be in as a researcher, is to not have any like real responsibility beyond doing the research and really getting to focus on making that like the best possible thesis that it can be.
And that's really important, isn't it, for the field of research too, because out of every PhD comes genuine research that will change something somewhere in the world, particularly in the field of science. So nowadays you have a lot of board roles, and I believe that you've co-founded a fellowship within the aerospace sector. How does your work in the governance space on board roles and this fellowship have an effect in the sector?
I think for the board roles, it's a really great way to make sure that different voices are heard in these different organizations. We've always had a problem with representation in the space and aerospace fields historically, and so getting the chance to speak in a number of contexts, in the academic sense, early career person, even though on the industry side, I'm very solidly considered like mid-career. Um,
Mm.
Speaking as like a woman in the industry, speaking as somebody with a disability, somebody from the LGBTQ community, being able to speak on all of those fronts, as well as being able to give the perspectives of academia, industry, and government in giving feedback can be really valuable. Because for some of these organizations, they tend to be dominated mostly by academics, maybe some mix of government folks, but you don't get a lot of cross pollination between academia, industry, and then the government side in scientific settings in particular. So, especially right now, we are graduating a ton of students in aerospace and in things like planetary science, astronomy, where there aren't enough academic jobs waiting for them at the end. So, historically in academia, it's been kind of frowned upon if you go and take the industry route. You're considered to be a failure in some way. And I think that perspective is very slowly changing. But opening that dialogue and getting both professors and students to recognize that industry is not inherently evil. People don't necessarily have to go into getting a graduate degree with the intent of being a professor at the other end. I knew when I went into my PhD that I had no intent of being a professor. That was never my career goal. And that's not meant to insult anybody that chooses that. I just knew that it wasn't aligned with what I wanted to do. Um, and so being able to kind of let people know what these opportunities are, either through organizations on the board where I can speak from an industry perspective and talk about the opportunities available, or through this fellowship, the Z Factor Fellowship, where we're actually connecting students directly with paid internship opportunities at companies, so that they get to see what's out there. For a lot of these students, we try to focus on students that haven't had any internships yet. So they're just trying to get their foot in the door into aerospace. So they might not have a clue what the landscape looks like in terms of what companies they should be looking at, how to apply for a job, how to structure their resume. We help them with all of these things, and make sure that we're setting them up with something so that they can hopefully have that be their doorway to success.
I notice, and this might be a little bit of a left field question, Tanya, but I notice in other professions, and particularly my own of education, where many of us come to PhDs much later in career. So, do the undergrad and potentially a master's, but often an undergrad and then a master's and a PhD, or either, comes later. And often from the motivation of contributing through the research topic, if you like, that's come from practice. So, from practicing in the field, and then the research topic emerges, I guess, as our own interests emerge, and then we want to further that study or further that investigation. Are you finding in aerospace it's more a clear trajectory from undergrad, masters through to PhD, earlier career than later? Is that how it's playing out? Because you talked a lot about how there are so many students coming into aerospace these days, which is fabulous, but then maybe not the place for them to be after that study.
Yeah, I think on the engineering side, it's a little different. I think most people don't tend to go for a PhD unless they're specifically aiming to be an academic. On the science side, since I'm a scientist, I can speak better to that side of things. I would say that the typical trajectory does tend to be just like undergrad straight through to PhD. You don't take a break at all. And I actually like the approach that you're describing. It's kind of what I ended up doing, but unintentionally. When I was applying for PhD programs at the end of my master's, I didn't have any real idea what my thesis should be about. There wasn't a particular topic about Mars that grabbed me where I'm like, yeah, I want to devote the next 4 to 6 years of my life on this. I just knew that I didn't want to do the same stuff I was doing during my master's. It was interesting, but it still wasn't exactly like it didn't grab me as much. But by the time I went and I worked in mission operations, I spent all that time working on cameras, looking at like visual data as opposed to before I was working in spectroscopy, which you're staring at a lot of squiggly lines all day. I liked looking at pictures more. So when I realized that I was really into cameras and camera operations and essentially figuring out that I was really into geomorphology. So like the shapes of things and what that tells you about the history of an area. When I came back to that same PhD supervisor I had applied to before, but like 4 years later, I had a list. I was like, here are, I think, maybe 5 topics that I think I am passionate enough about that I would like to do a whole thesis on. And when I presented them, he was like, well, it's clear that this one in particular is the thing that interests you the most. So I think you should do this. It was conveniently the thing I had been doing research on the whole time I was in that industry job. So I had a lot of experience coming in. I had done a lot of background work. It made doing the thesis research go much more quickly. But it's also saved me a lot of time in that I didn't have to discover what that thing was or spend some time working on a project that my heart wasn't really in at the end of the day, and maybe I was just doing it to check a box to say yes, I have a PhD. Instead, I was like, I want to be the expert in this one very particular thing on Mars.
Yeah, and it's about, isn't it about taking, I guess what's come to mind as I've talked to you, you're a living example of, you found your passion really early, you knew what it was, you were clear, the space somewhere, and you've found a way to make it the rest of your life so far. You've found a way to earn money from it, to contribute, and I guess leave a legacy out of a passion. How often in education we tell young people, find your passion and then find a way to work in that area. But you've done that, so it's a brilliant example. I'm keen to hear your views as we get closer to the end of our conversation, your views on what you think must be done to move closer to gender equality and the place of encouraging women into the broad STEM fields within this goal. Where are the barriers for women entering STEM still, and what else can be done?
I think we're seeing a huge increase in the number of women that are entering, but we still have a really leaky pipeline on the other end. And I think it's great that we've invested so heavily as a field in outreach opportunities for children through high school, undergrad, to try to encourage more women to come into the field. I've seen the change in the demographics from the first conferences I went to back in 2006 or so till now. I mean, oh gosh, it's like literally 20 years. You can see that the groups are more diverse, which is awesome. But you also can clearly see that the diversity is very weighted to the younger end. And we're still not seeing women get promoted into leadership positions. A lot of women end up leaving at different periods, whether it's due to harassment or unfavorable conditions for like supporting mothers when they need to take time off or when they get pregnant. So I think we need to be spending just as much time addressing the other end of the pipeline as we do trying to get women in the first place, because if we don't fix it to be a less toxic and more supportive environment, then we get them in, but we're not creating a place where they want to stay. And I think we don't talk about that enough in the industry because no one wants to sound like the squeaky wheel. Like people are like, well, I've made it. Look, it's great. There's a lot more women. Like this is all wonderful. But at the same time, we have a lot of like really positive female empowerment talk on social media, specifically in the space industry. But I've had young women reach out to me, like undergrads or women that were in undergrad and they end up leaving the field saying, I saw this content and I thought that it meant that all these problems had gone away. And so when I experienced, harassment at my job or harassment at the university, like I thought it was just me. They feel really alone. And so I think it's important that we talk about the fact that these problems are still here and do need to be addressed, because if we just kind of pretend that they don't exist anymore, we're not really helping anybody and we're not fixing anything at the end of the day.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the barriers are still there but not talked about. So I think that's quite often the case about so many other things in the broad gender equality space, STEM and women here. I hear it's still happening in engineering and medicine and lots of other places where I suppose it's only in the last 10, 15, 20 years where more women are going into those fields. And I think it's a real issue for us in the world. And it's not just women's work, is it? There's education to go. So I wonder, on a more personal space, Tanya, if you're willing to delve into how you navigate challenges and barriers that you face. So you've raised the idea of one particular barrier. How do you navigate that yourself? Where do you find support and guidance when you need it?
I think ever since I was a kid, I've had the personality of if someone tells me that I can't do something, I'm just like, well, why not? I remember very specifically, I was probably like 8 or 9, something like that. I had gotten really obsessed with baseball, and I told my dad that I wanted to be an umpire in the Major League Baseball. I don't know why an umpire specifically, but his response was, well, they don't let women be umpires. And I said, that's okay, I'll just be the first one. And I feel like that trend kind of continued throughout my life. Like if I ran into a roadblock somewhere, I never saw it as like a permanent no. It was just, okay, this didn't work. So let's find the way around this to make this thing work. If it was something that I cared enough about, I was going to try to figure out how to do it. And I think a lot of people get discouraged more easily. And that's where I think it's really important to find that thing that you are so passionate about that you are willing to like crawl through the mud
Mm,
in like 100-degree heat or something like
mm,
that to get to the goal that you want. And I feel lucky to have found that thing so early in life. I know that some people never find that thing. Um, but whatever it is, whether it's the thing you turn into your career or the thing that is just like the passion that you have in your life, but maybe it isn't the thing that becomes your job, like find that thing that you're willing to be that passionate about. And I feel like that can kind of help you craft that same approach to other things in your life so that you realize, like, oh, if I want something badly enough and I'm willing to just figure out how to make it work, it might not be easy, but there's generally a way that you can push through and try your hardest to make it happen.
mm. What do you think your leadership superpowers are? What's the Tanya superpowers that you rely on in your everyday life, in your consulting work, in your board work?
I think just being myself in any setting, and part of that is being kind of unabashedly honest in giving feedback or direction in things. I will try to do it in a way that is always very like nice and compassionate, and approach things from a place of, it doesn't help to just insult people or like act like some kind of dictator. But just talking to people like they're people, understanding where they're coming from in a conversation, and just like, I don't know, not trying to feel like I am above somebody in a particular conversation. I feel like that's gone a long way. You end up in a lot of these situations, I think professionally, where there's this forced sense of formality or like people having to put on a mask, and that you don't get to see the real person behind there, and it gives this sense of, like you can see the mask, you can tell that it's a little bit fake, and I think that blocks being able to really bond with people and get them to want to work with you, want to open up to you about the information that they need to share. So if you just are yourself and you're a very genuine person, it's really easy for other people to read that, and it encourages them to be genuine right back. And if you're trying to do something like provide strategic feedback into how an organization can run more efficiently or fix cultural problems that they might be having, you need to build trust with people to get them to open up to tell you what the problems are that they're having. Otherwise, they'll just see you as, oh, this is somebody that the CEO sent in to, get information, and then
Mm,
they're going to go back and I'm going to get in trouble for talking to
mm,
them. And, I never want anybody to
mm,
feel like that. I'm like, I'm here
mm,
because I do want to help make things better. And so I want to hear from you and understand, like, what's working, what's not, what do you think needs to be
mm,
fixed? And then I can take that, anonymize it, feed it back to the folks that want the answers to these questions.
mm. So, Tanya, as we wrap up our amazing conversation today, what thoughts do you want to leave with those who are watching or listening?
I think the thought of, if there's a thing that you love and you really want to do it, if you work to find the way to make it happen, it will happen. Don't let roadblocks deter you from your goal. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't do it. It might not be easy. It might not be a linear path, but I truly believe that there are ways to make the things happen in your life that you want to happen, whether it's professionally or personally. Like, you just have to be really, really dedicated to wanting to figure out how to make that work.
Tanya, as I said earlier, you're a living example of finding your passion, finding a way for it to guide your life, to do amazing things that some of us would have only dreamed of. So thank you. And thank you for being part of the broader Zonta community as an alumni of the Amelia Earhart Fellowship. It's a pleasure to speak with you today, and I wish you all the best as you continue to pursue your dreams.
Thanks so much. I'm truly honored to be part of this amazing community of people, and thanks so much for having me on.